October wind rushing through the trees. Margaret Collins stood alone at her husband Richard's grave, her black coat pulled tight but still no match for the chill. 43 years of marriage, and yet, as she looked down at the freshly turned soil, she felt like she was saying goodbye to a stranger. A voice broke the silence. "Miss Collins?" Margaret turned and saw a man in his early 50s walking toward her. His suit was sharp, his expression serious but gentle. He stopped a few steps away, lowering his voice. "I'm sorry to approach you at such a difficult time. My name is Michael Turner. I was Richard's business partner." Margaret blinked. She had heard Richard mention Michael's name once or twice, but Richard had always kept his business world separate from their home life. Seeing Michael here, his face carrying both pity and urgency, unsettled her. Michael reached inside his jacket and produced a manila envelope. Margaret froze when she saw her name written across the front. The handwriting was unmistakable, Richard's careful script, the same hand that had signed birthday cards and written love notes when they were young. "Richard asked me to give this to you if anything ever happened to him," Michael said quietly. "He told me to wait until after the funeral, and only when you were alone." Margaret's fingers trembled as she accepted the envelope. "What is this?" she whispered, though part of her feared the answer. Michael's gaze dropped. "I think Richard wanted to explain some things himself. I am truly sorry, Margaret. For everything." With that, he turned and walked back toward the parking lot, leaving her standing in the cold with the envelope that suddenly felt heavier than stone. Margaret sat on a nearby bench, staring at her name on the paper. Her heart pounded as memories of Richard's final months flooded back, his late nights, his distance, the way Emily, their daughter, had brushed off her worries. Slowly, she slid a finger under the flap. Inside was a small brass key and a folded piece of paper with an address she did not recognize. Margaret's world tilted, and she knew her life was about to change forever. Before the envelope, before the secrets, Margaret believed her life was ordinary in the best possible way. She had built her world around Richard Collins, the man she married at 24. Back then she was a young elementary school teacher who loved her work. But when Emily was born, Richard convinced her to leave teaching. "Our daughter deserves a full-time mother," he had said, kissing her forehead. "And I need a wife who can help me manage the social side of my growing firm. We're a team, Margaret. My work builds the future, and your work keeps the foundation strong." It had sounded romantic, even noble. Margaret poured herself into the role. She hosted elegant dinners for Richard's colleagues, learned the difference between a cabernet and a merlot, memorized details about his projects so she could make small talk at company events. Their home became known as the warm, welcoming place where Richard's partners and clients could relax while deals quietly took shape over her homemade lasagna. To the outside world, they looked like a model family. Emily thrived in school, later excelling in debate and earning a place at a top law school. Richard's architectural firm grew, and his name appeared in glossy magazines about the city's rising skyline. Margaret was the ever-present support, driving Emily to music lessons, making sure Richard's suits were pressed, and maintaining a household that seemed picture-perfect. Richard often told her, "You're the reason I can focus on designing buildings. Without you keeping everything running smoothly, none of this would be possible." Emily, too, praised her mother to friends. "Dad builds skyscrapers," she would say, "but Mom builds our life." Those words warmed Margaret's heart, convincing her that her sacrifices were not in vain. Their evenings around the dinner table seemed to confirm it, Richard sharing stories of his firm's projects, Emily excitedly talking about school, and Margaret listening, laughing, encouraging. On weekends, they planned family vacations, celebrated milestones, and spoke about the future. Richard promised that when Emily was fully established, he and Margaret would travel the world together. "Rome, Paris, Barcelona, we'll see them all," he said, spreading travel brochures across the coffee table. Margaret believed him completely. She believed in their partnership, in the love story they had built. She thought her marriage was strong, her sacrifices meaningful, and her future secure. She had no idea that beneath the polished surface, the foundation of her life was slowly crumbling. The first real crack appeared during what should have been a joyful evening. Emily had just passed the bar exam, and Richard insisted they celebrate at Romano's, the upscale Italian restaurant where their family marked every milestone. The table glowed with candlelight, a bottle of expensive champagne chilling nearby, Emily's new law school ring catching the light as she lifted her glass. Margaret felt a rush of pride, the kind only a mother could feel. "I'm so proud of both of you," Margaret said, smiling across the table. "Emily, you've worked so hard for this moment. And Richard, you've given her everything she needed to succeed. She set her glass down, her heart full. Then, almost without thinking, she added, watching Emily begin her career has made me think about mine. I've been looking at part-time teaching positions at Roosevelt Elementary. They have an opening for substitutes, and I thought maybe I could return to the classroom." The silence that followed was sharp, like someone had turned off the music. Richard's smile faltered, then returned in a strained, amused way. Emily glanced at her father, and in that quick exchange of looks Margaret saw something unsettling: shared doubt, even condescension. Richard chuckled softly. "Sweetheart, you've been out of the classroom for 22 years. Education has changed completely. New technology, new methods. Who's going to hire someone who hasn't taught since Emily was in diapers?" The words stung, but before she could respond, Emily leaned forward, her tone gentle yet dismissive. "Mom, maybe you're being a little unrealistic. You've been amazing at keeping everything together at home, but the professional world has moved on. You might be happier volunteering at the library or something less demanding." Margaret's cheeks burned. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Richard waved his hand, cutting her off. "Let's not spoil Emily's celebration with impractical fantasies. You have a perfectly fulfilling life here. Why complicate things?" The rest of the dinner passed with laughter and toasts, but for Margaret the warmth had drained from the room. Their easy smiles now felt distant, as though she were no longer part of the same story. That night, long after the champagne bubbles had faded, she opened an old cedar chest and pulled out her teaching certificate and recommendation letters. Once they had called her patient, creative, gifted with children. When had those qualities turned into nothing more than unrealistic fantasies? If the dinner at Romano's left Margaret unsettled, the company Christmas party that December shattered what little confidence she had left. For 20 years she had looked forward to the event at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. It was her chance to dress elegantly, to feel part of Richard's professional world, to share in his success. That year she chose the emerald green dress Richard had once said made her eyes shine. She spent the afternoon at the salon, following Emily's advice on her hairstyle, hoping to look polished and proud beside her accomplished husband and daughter. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers and laughter. Margaret smiled, mingled, and excused herself to step toward the powder room. As she walked down a side hallway, she heard Richard's voice echoing from a small group gathered near the alcove. Curious, she slowed her steps. "The secret to my success," Richard was saying, his tone confident, "is having a wife who manages the domestic details so I can focus on the real work." The men around him chuckled. Margaret froze, her heart pounding. "Elena," he stopped himself, corrected with ease, "Margaret has been a wonderful housefrau all these years. She throws great parties, keeps the house perfect, but she wouldn't understand modern business if her life depended on it. She still thinks substitute teaching is realistic at her age." The laughter that followed cut through Margaret like broken glass. These were men she had cooked for, wives she had befriended, family she had welcomed into her home. And now they were laughing at her dreams, her dignity, her very place in Richard's life. She stepped into view, and the group fell silent. Michael Turner, Richard's partner, looked away quickly, guilt flickering in his eyes. Richard, unfazed, smiled smoothly. "Ah, perfect timing. Gentlemen, look how lovely she is tonight." He wrapped an arm around her waist, a gesture that felt like performance, not affection. Then he added casually, "Margaret, why don't you help Miss Patterson with the coat check? They could use your organizational skills." And just like that, Margaret was dismissed, pushed to the sidelines of her own husband's celebration. She spent the rest of the night quietly hanging coats, invisible to everyone except when they needed her hands. 3 weeks after the Christmas party, Richard suffered his first heart attack. The doctors called it mild, more of a warning than a crisis, but for Margaret it was a moment of reckoning. She cared for him around the clock, managing his medication, cooking heart-healthy meals, creating a quiet space for recovery. For 2 weeks, Richard seemed softer, even grateful. "I don't know what I would do without you," he said one afternoon as she brought him soup. For a fleeting moment, Margaret believed a scare might draw them closer again. But as soon as he was cleared to return to work, the warmth evaporated. When Margaret suggested they use this second chance to slow down and reconnect, Richard snapped. "I don't have time for your neediness. Emily and I have real responsibilities. You're here to keep the house running, not to cling to me like some desperate housewife." His words landed like a blow. In that instant, Margaret realized her devotion was invisible, useful only when convenient. Not long after, Richard was gone. His second heart attack came without warning. The funeral was dignified, the eulogies glowing. Everyone praised his brilliance, his vision, his contributions to the city. Margaret stood quietly, holding back tears, a part of her grieving, another part strangely numb. When Michael Turner handed her the envelope at the cemetery, she could not yet imagine how fully it would rewrite her life. A week later, Margaret drove to the address scrawled in Richard's handwriting. It led her across town to a modest brick apartment building, Unit 3 billion. Her hands shook as the brass key turned in the lock. Inside, she found an entirely furnished home. Richard's clothes in the closet, his coffee mug in the sink, his glasses on the nightstand. But what stopped her cold were the photographs on the dresser, Richard smiling arm in arm with another woman. Vacation photos, birthday celebrations, moments of intimacy Margaret had never shared with him. The woman's name was Linda, written in affectionate notes tucked into drawers. Margaret's stomach twisted as she discovered financial statements in Richard's desk. Over 5 years, he had siphoned more than $200,000 from their joint accounts to support this second life. And then she found the final wound, a sealed letter in Richard's hand, addressed to her, dated 2 weeks before his death. In it, he confessed everything: his affair, his financial deception, and worst of all, his deliberate efforts to keep her small. "You gave me your youth, your devotion, and I returned it with control disguised as protection," he wrote. "I was terrified that if you found your independence, you would see you no longer needed me. So I made sure you never believed you could stand on your own." Margaret read the letter again and again, her hands trembling, grief mixed with fury. At last she understood. She hadn't been invisible by accident, she had been erased on purpose. Margaret sat in that apartment for hours, surrounded by evidence of the man she thought she knew. The photographs, the receipts, the confession letter, all of it screamed betrayal. But somewhere in the middle of the pain, another feeling began to stir. It was not just sorrow or anger. It was something steadier, sharper: resolve. For 43 years, Richard had convinced her she wasn't capable, that her dreams were childish, that her worth existed only in how well she supported others. Now, with his words laid bare on paper, Margaret saw the truth: she had been capable all along. She had simply been caged. The next morning she pulled her teaching certificate from its box again. The paper was yellowed with age, but her name, Margaret Collins, still shone proudly across the top. She thought of the students she once guided, the letters of recommendation praising her creativity and patience. That woman wasn't gone. She had been buried under years of dismissal, but she was still alive, waiting. Margaret called the community college she had seen advertising for instructors. Her voice shook slightly as she introduced herself. "This is Margaret Collins. I'm a retired teacher interested in returning to the classroom." To her surprise, the department coordinator responded warmly, scheduling an interview for the following week. Not once did the woman question her age or qualifications. Margaret hung up the phone with tears in her eyes, and for the first time since Richard's funeral, she smiled. The days that followed became a quiet revolution. She enrolled in online courses to refresh her teaching methods, learning how to use interactive whiteboards and digital assessment tools. She opened a personal bank account in her own name, money entirely separate from the estate Richard had left behind. She joined a yoga class at the community center, something Richard had once dismissed as silly for someone her age. The instructor, a vibrant woman in her 70s, welcomed her. "You have such natural balance," she said with a grin. "Some of us just bloom later in life." The words sank deep, warming Margaret in a way she hadn't felt in years. She also sought out a financial advisor, recommended by her sister, and began to learn how to manage her own resources. The advisor, calm and practical, laid out Margaret's assets. "You're in a stronger position than you realize," she explained. Margaret listened, asked questions, and understood. With each conversation, the fog Richard had wrapped around her for decades lifted a little more. Every step, every new skill learned, every choice made on her own felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. The key that had once opened the door to Richard's betrayal she had taken to a local artisan and transformed into a pendant. It now hung around her neck, not as a symbol of pain, but as a reminder. From this moment forward, her life would be her own. Margaret was no longer waiting to be included. She was building a future where her worth was not measured by anyone else's approval, and this time she would not be erased. It didn't take long for Emily to notice the change. She arrived one afternoon, expecting to find her mother lost in grief, perhaps still struggling to manage the house without Richard. Instead, she walked into the kitchen and saw Margaret at the table surrounded by lesson plans, a laptop open to a digital curriculum program, red pen in hand. Her mother looked focused, confident, even happy. "Mom, what's all this?" Emily asked, dropping her briefcase on a chair. Her tone carried that familiar edge of amusement, the same tone Richard had used whenever Margaret spoke about things too complicated for her. Margaret didn't look up from the paper she was grading. "I'm preparing lessons for my new teaching position. I start at Riverside Community College next week." Silence filled the room. Emily blinked as though she hadn't heard correctly. "Teaching? Mom, we already talked about this. You've been out of education for over 20 years. Don't you think this is setting yourself up for disappointment?" Margaret calmly placed her pen down and met her daughter's eyes. "Emily, I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm telling you what I've decided. There's a difference." Emily shifted in her chair, unsettled. "But the stress, the technology, the students, you're not ready for something so demanding. You've barely processed Dad's death." Margaret closed her laptop, her voice steady. "I've already updated my credentials. I've trained on the new technology, and I've been hired based on my qualifications, not on anyone's doubts. Your father spent years convincing me I wasn't capable. You've done the same without realizing it. But the truth is, I am capable." Her daughter's expression flickered between disbelief and confusion. For the first time, Emily wasn't speaking to the uncertain mother she could manage. She was facing a woman who had made her own decision and didn't need approval. "Mom," Emily began again, her voice softer now, "I just don't want you to get hurt." Margaret smiled gently, but her words carried steel. "Emily, I've been hurt for decades by being dismissed, ignored, and kept small. Standing on my own isn't what will hurt me. Staying invisible would." Emily said nothing more that day. She left quietly, her confidence shaken, as though she no longer recognized the woman sitting at that kitchen table. For the first time in their relationship, the balance of power had shifted and Margaret had no intention of giving it back. A few weeks later, Margaret received a call from Michael Turner, Richard's former business partner. His voice was cautious, the same tone he had used at the cemetery. "Margaret, I think it's time we talk. There are things about Richard's business you need to know." They met at a quiet cafe downtown. Michael's suit was neat, but his eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. He set a folder on the table between them. Richard wasn't just keeping secrets in his personal life. He was stealing from the firm. "I discovered that he had been redirecting client payments into accounts only he controlled. Nearly $850,000 went missing." Margaret's breath caught. Betrayal upon betrayal. "And now?" she asked. Michael exhaled. "I've worked with forensic accountants. We've recovered the funds, plus penalties. After restitution, there's a surplus about $400,000 that legally belongs to you, as his widow." She stared at the papers, struggling to believe what she was hearing. Richard was preparing to run, Michael continued. He had offshore accounts, plans to disappear completely. The heart attack stopped him before he could leave everything behind. Margaret's chest tightened. The man she had supported, defended, and loved had been ready to abandon not just her, but his entire life. Yet as Michael's words sank in, another thought rose. Maybe his betrayal could be turned into something else. Michael leaned forward. "I want to do something meaningful with this. Margaret, I know you've started teaching again. What if we use this money to build a program? Something that helps women over 50 re-enter the workforce, learn financial skills, regain their confidence, turn Richard's selfishness into second chances for others." For the first time, Margaret didn't feel powerless. She reached for the folder, her voice steady. "Yes, Michael, let's turn his lies into someone else's freedom." 1 year after Richard's funeral, Margaret stood at the front of her classroom at Riverside Community College. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, falling across the faces of her students, men and women in their 50s and 60s, single mothers, veterans, immigrants, each of them carrying stories of struggle and resilience. She guided them patiently through their literacy exam, her voice calm, her encouragement genuine. Watching their determination, Margaret felt something powerful, purpose. Not borrowed purpose, not supporting someone else's dream, but her own. On her desk sat a framed photo from the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the Collins Center for Women's Advancement, the nonprofit she and Michael had launched using the money Richard once tried to hide. Behind her smile in the photo stood 22 women, the first graduating class of their 6-month program. They had learned job skills, financial literacy, and most importantly the confidence to rebuild their lives. The center had become a beacon for women told they were too old or not capable, a place where second chances bloomed. Margaret's own life had blossomed too. She had sold the large suburban home Richard once designed and moved into a bright, modern apartment filled with colors and books she loved. Her new space reflected her, not him. Around her neck hung the pendant crafted from the brass key that had opened Richard's secret apartment. Once a symbol of betrayal, it now reminded her daily of the door she had walked through to find her own freedom. Emily visited on Sundays now. Their conversations were different, mutual, respectful, marked by pauses where Emily listened instead of instructing. One afternoon, as they walked in the park near Margaret's apartment, Emily said softly, "Mom, I'm proud of you. Not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you've become." Margaret smiled, her heart steady. She hadn't become someone new. She had simply remembered who she had always been. As Margaret looked around her classroom at her students bent over their exams, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. Richard's lies had once defined her world. Now, her truth defined hers. The woman who had been erased was visible again, not as someone's wife or someone's mother, but as Margaret Collins' teacher, mentor, and survivor. Looking back, Margaret often thought about the brass key that started it all. At first it felt like a curse, an unwanted door into betrayal and heartbreak. But over time she realized it was a gift. That key had not just unlocked Richard's secret life. It had unlocked her own strength, a strength she had buried under decades of silence. Her journey carried a simple but profound truth: it is never too late to reclaim yourself. Others may try to define your worth, to convince you that your dreams are unrealistic or your time has passed. But Margaret's story shows that those voices are lies. The truth is that dignity and purpose don't expire with age. They wait quietly for us to remember them. If you have ever felt invisible, overlooked, or dismissed, remember Margaret. Remember that a lifetime of sacrifice does not mean you must disappear. You are still capable of new beginnings. You can still surprise yourself with what you can build, no matter when you start. Her life after Richard wasn't about revenge in the loud, dramatic sense. It was about quiet justice, the justice of living fully after being told she couldn't. And in that, Margaret found peace. She found herself. As we close this story, I want to invite you to reflect. What is the key in your own life that might open a new door? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if Margaret's journey touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.